Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's Friday, so it's time to ramble. We thank you for joining us. Now, we're going to have a little fun today because we're going to talk about, well, an X-Men crossover that most people don't think about, but does have some historical significance. Now, when you say crossovers, people assume, stuff that involves 2, 3, 4, 5 titles. Heck, these days, they'll put out crossovers that involve the entire company. You'll get like 20 different books involved in this. But that's usually why they also use the term crossover event. This is actually only involves 2 books. So it's a small crossover. Just about 5 parts. So why is it so important? Well, it features everybody's fabulous merry mutant buddies. And due to when it occurred, it actually helped set up one of the major dividing points in X-Men history. As in, this was one of the few clear-cut times you could say there was a distinct change in era from one set of X-Men books to the other. Bit of a background first. This crossover involves the Uncanny X-Men title and the X-Factor title. While New Mutants was around at the time, it was not involved in this crossover. And while Excalibur was around at the time, it definitely was not involved in this crossover, as Excalibur was, while technically an X-Men spin-off book, very much doing its own thing. There's only a handful of occasions where the classic Excalibur title did cross over with X-Men storylines, which was one of those things that made Excalibur an interesting book to read. You could read it without really keeping track of anything else going on in other X-Men titles, so you didn't feel obligated to buy a bunch of other books. So what specifically was going on in the X-Men books leading up to this? Well, we had previously discussed the Extinction Agenda storyline in another video review, which, if you want to pause this video and go back and watch that one, feel free to, or watch it after this video. Either way you want to do it. But if you haven't seen that video yet, go ahead and watch it because it's an interesting review. Now, in that, the X-Men, X-Factor, and the New Mutants all work together, but not everything was cut and dry. See, leading up to Extinction Agenda, there had been a period where the X-Men had been scattered by this mystical gateway artifact thing called the Siege Perilous, and many of them were rendered amnesic so that they could live new lives far away from the whole superhero thing, attempting to find happiness. Now, by and large, the X-Men had managed to reunite, although Colossus had not been brought back into the fold. This is because when Colossus was found, he was living as an artist named Peter Nichols and was quite happy. Therefore, nobody really wanted to drag him out of that life and restore him to their buddy Colossus because, dude, the guy had everything he wanted, basically. He was getting to make his art. He didn't have to get a day job. And nobody was trying to kill him. So they had left Colossus alone. Unfortunately, in the months leading up to this particular crossover we are discussing today, which, if you had paid attention to the title of the video, which is right down there underneath the video, this is a story arc called the Muir Island Saga. Or Muir Island, depending on how you like to pronounce that word. So, as we were saying, in the year leading up to the year or so, leading up to the Muir Island Saga, we had seen various supporting characters, especially those who lived on Muir Isle, acting odd. And hints that something was influencing their behavior. Well, it should be noted that these residents of Muir Isle, which included Xavier's close friend and occasional possible love interest, Moira McTaggart, and several mutants who, for one reason or another, were not really frontline X-Men fighters at the time. Some had been injured, some had had their powers altered and were readjusting them. Some just weren't warriors by nature. So, what happened? Well, the old X-Men villain, the Shadow King, happened. Shadow King is a being who is essentially a psychic parasite. Originally found by Xavier in the host body of a Malfarok, Shadow King is just pure evil. It is... The easiest way to put it is, it's like every evil thought humanity had ever had was just mushed together into one psychic entity that would possess people so it could do evil things to the living. After being smacked around by Xavier and other members of the X-Men a few different times, Shadow King had come up with a different plot. Setting himself up in several host bodies instead of simply one, he began subtly influencing events around the globe to stir up hatred and general senses of wishes for violence against other people. Shadow King then in turn, being a psychic parasitic being of evil intent, was feeding off that hatred to make himself stronger. This all culminates in the Muir Island Saga, where the X-Men decide to see what's going on Muir Isle and discover that all of the residents were now under the control of the Shadow King. And when the X-Men showed up on the island, they became victims of the Shadow King as well. The only person who had managed to stay immune from this was the inventor and former military veteran Forge, who was now running for his life around Muir Isle, trying to figure out how to rescue his friends and stop the Shadow King from plunging the world into a psychic storm of hatred and violence. Meanwhile, Xavier, who had regained the ability to walk a little while before this event, was being hunted by some of the Shadow King's pawns as well, including the artist Peter Nichols, aka Colossus, who, having been amnesic from it and not remembering his time as an X-Man, was easy prey to be brainwashed by the Shadow King. Colossus confronts Xavier and his allies in the otherwise abandoned X-Mansion, which Xavier has to let self-destruct in order to physically stun Colossus long enough for Xavier to release him from the Shadow King's control. This is done by Xavier erasing the Peter Nichols persona from Colossus, because that's where Shadow King had sunk his little hooks in. Thus, we got back classic Colossus, though he rejoined the X-Men at the cost of having given up his happy civilian life. And so, it all culminates with Xavier calling upon X-Factor to help him storm Muir Isle, where we get a civil war of X-Man versus X-Man. X-Factor, of course, being the original 5 X-Men, managed to hold their own as they had had the most combat experience at this point, although Forge was helping on his end as well, as he managed to invent a gun that, if he shot you with it, would break the Shadow King's hold on you, because that's what he does. Literally, Forge's mutant power is, if he can imagine it, no matter how crazy it sounds, he can invent it. So all he has to do is think, dude, I need a gun that can unbrainwash mutants who are under the control of this super evil psychic parasite, give him some physical resources and some free time when people aren't trying to kill him, he'll invent that gun. He may not be able to explain to anybody else how to build it, but he will build that gun. That is Forge's mutant power in a nutshell. So with Forge freeing various members of the X-Men, at least temporarily, from Shadow King's control, along with the newly arrived X-Factor and Professor Xavier, seems like everything's going to work out, right? Well, not quite. See, the Shadow King decides to pull his ace up his sleeve and takes possession of longtime Muir Isle resident David Haller, aka Legion. Now, Legion is the son of Professor Xavier and Gabrielle Haller. Legion inherited his father's incredible psychic power, but unfortunately, due to his somewhat traumatic upbringing and the fact that Xavier was never there for him as a father figure, Legion is not exactly the most mentally healthy individual. As the name Legion implies, over the years, he developed what we would now call dissociative identity disorder, but is classically known to most people, especially in entertainment, as multiple personalities. The real fun of this is Legion had powers his father did not, because, hey, mutants, that's what mutancy is all about. And each personality had control of one different power. Thus, David Haller might be a telepath, but a different personality has telekinesis, a different personality has pyrokinesis. Basically, hey, I can make stuff catch fire with my mind. I explode you with my brain, etc., etc. Well, Shadow King managed to get possession of all of David's fractured psyche and used him as the ultimate final weapon, as in one massive blast of pyrokinesis and telekinesis, Legion leveled the majority of Muir Isle and knocked out almost every person on the island. Xavier thus goes into the psychic plane to attack Shadow King directly, while the unbrainwashed and still conscious allies protect his body on the physical plane. After a hard-fought match in which Xavier gets some assistance from the original X-Men, most especially fellow psychic Jean Grey, Xavier manages to finally banish the Shadow King and save the day, although it is at the cost of his own legs. Once again, restoring Xavier to the classic image we have of him as a man in a wheelchair. He takes this all in good stride, though, especially when it seems like being the host body of the Shadow King, when he is smacked around and banished to the farthest corners of the psychic planes once and for all, puts David Haller into a deep coma. This is personified in a wonderful sequence in which Xavier goes into David's mind to try to wake him up and receives various mental images based on classic real-world metaphors such as he's one brick shy of a wall, the lights are on but nobody's home, which was basically Xavier's way of telling himself, David's mind is gone. Shadow King took David's mind with him. Now, of course, longtime X-Men readers do know eventually Legion would return, though it would take a few years. And the immediate side effect of that possession was that at least temporarily, the main personality of David Haller had control of all of the powers his fractured psyche had seemingly healed, though this would not last forever, because, hey, mental health is tricky, especially when we didn't actually try to cure you, just manipulate and abuse you, because evil psychic parasite. More immediate effects of this crossover was having assisted the X-Men in a major crisis for the second time in recent weeks. The X-Factor decides to fully reunite with the X-Men. Thus, you now have a 14-person strong team. X-Factor being disbanded, along with the recent disbandment of villains turned not exactly 100% happy about it. Government Agents Freedom Force, in storylines shortly preceding the Muir Island Saga, meant that there was something to be said for some mutants willing to work with the government. Since Val Cooper was on the island as one of Xavier's human allies, and Val Cooper, of course, being a long-standing member of the government who specifically works in the department based around keeping various superpowered people from not upsetting and freaking out the government too much. I'm not even kidding. That's a thing in Marvel Comics. Decades ago, they created the Commission on Superhuman Activities, whose entire purpose is to be a department of the federal government who keeps track of the various superheroes and makes sure that what they do does not act against the American interests, and occasionally sponsor and train superpowered government agents. Val decides this time she's not going to recruit villains, but recruit people who actually want to be superheroes as opposed to just plain avoid prison. So, does it sound familiar? 14 X-Men, enough to make 2 teams? An X-Factor team that's government-sponsored? Yes, it does. See, I told you the impacts were historically significant, and this is why. These issues of Uncanny X-Men and X-Factor were the last issues before the early 90s reboot of the entire X-Men line. Specifically, the one that started in late 1991. That's right. This reboot saw New Mutants be retitled into X-Force and start over with number 1. X-Factor, as I just said, become a government-sponsored team fronted by Havoc and featuring characters who by and large had never been major starring members of any mutant title, such as off-and-on reservist X-Man Polaris, usually Avengers, but always tending to pick fights with them as much as the villains, Quicksilver, former New Mutant Wolvesbane, who had left the team after the events of Extinction Agenda, and never really been part of any regular mutant team, but had popped up intermittently throughout the years, Multiple Man and mutant bodyguard Guido, who would go on to take the name Strong Guy, because why not? This, of course, would lead to what many consider in the long term to be the definitive X-Factor title, as it was taken over by the iconic Peter David, but we're going to talk about that in another episode, because that is its own thing, most definitely. For the X-Men, we would see Uncanny X-Men split off a new X-Men book, simply called X-Men, also known as Adjective Lists, to oppose it to Uncanny, with each one featuring a dedicated squad, the well-known and legendary Gold and Blue teams, each team being a mix of the original 5, the members introduced in Giant-Size X-Men, which is where Wolverine, Colossus, Nightcrawler, Storm come in, and people like Rogue and Gambit, who would join the team later on over the years. So, comes down to it. Is it actually a good story? Well, yeah, it kind of is. You get to see a whole bunch of mutants and human allies of the X-Men going back and forth, fighting with each other, and cementing themselves as powerful mutants, with a bit of a tease of the next era yet to come. It was a wonderful end, tying up various plot threads and up to this point unresolved plot lines, all in time to create for new writers and artists to come in with newly shuffled rosters, a new book in one case, and a fresh slate. What's the big con of it? Well, as I said a few times throughout the video, you kind of have to have read a lot of what was going on in the books the last year or so to get a real feel for what was going on in the series. It's not a crossover event you can give to somebody who's never really read an X-Men comic, because it assumes you already know the basics of who a lot of these characters are. But all of that aside, it is very well written. You get an epilogue which has a wonderful story with Xavier coming to terms with the fact that his son, that he had never really done right by, was now clinically brain dead and in a deep coma, along with him once again losing use of his legs, forcing him to have a moment of evaluation about the choices he's made in his life and if he wants to continue on this path. You get a chance for various X-Men to take the spotlight, including, as I have said, people like Forge and Polaris, who up to this point had not been given regular roles in any of the books, and so were kind of easy to overlook in the big grand scheme of things. And of course you have your A-listers who are still around kicking butt like A-listers do. Looking at you, Wolverine and Cyclops. So, it's like this. If you know a thing or two about the X-Men during the 80s, definitely pick this up, because this was basically the end of the iconic Chris Claremont run on Uncanny X-Men. Well, he would stick around for a few issues to help launch the new adjectiveless X-Men title. He didn't stick around for long. This is, in a lot of ways, the last story that really feels like a classic Claremont story, as it had a long build-up and foreshadowing to it, featured characters that he had either debuted or put so much polish and new layers to, the people just kind of felt like they were characters that belonged to him, and serves as a wonderful way of describing exactly how you set up a new era. With a massive battle full of lots of violence and fun action-y Hollywood type explosions. I mean, seriously, they blew up like 2/3 of an island off the coast of Scotland. How impressive is that? And when it's all said and done, make sure that behind these superhero costumes and code names, these are people. with their own anxieties, their own dreams, their own passions, and their own moral principles that define, are they hero or are they villain? So, if you know the X-Men, check out the Muir Island Saga. If you're brand new to the X-Men, check it out eventually, but first, hit up some online resources to familiarize yourself with what had been going on in the books leading up to this. My personal suggestion is UncannyXmen.net, a fan-run site that has been around for, let's see, let me look at my dates real quick. UncannyXmen.net. Let's see, you do not really, you're no longer bragging about. They have been around for a couple decades. Sorry about that, folks. I'm excited to find the, find that information. They don't always brag about it directly on the website itself. But yes, UncannyXmen.net, which is an incredible resource. It's been going for a couple decades. Got a great message board forum where you can interact with the staff of the site, as well as the various people who just enjoy the site and like and chatting comics with each other, including yours personally. Cheap plug. Which means that if you're not sure where to start, you can ask people and we'll all be happy to give you a quick rundown of, okay, you want to read this big storyline? You're not sure what you need to know leading into it? Here, check out these stories, or, you know what, here, bada bam, here's a quick breakdown in a couple posts. Dang. That's how you do it. Because that's what it's all about, folks. Not just being a fan of stuff, but being a fan that respects the fact not everybody knows everything you do and is more than happy to answer questions so everybody can get a better idea of why you appreciate this stuff. And that's what we bring to Roulette Productions as well. A sense of, hey, we're all on the same team. If you want to sit there and know about something so you can know why it's worth being a fan of, we're here for you. If you just want to laugh at the fanboys gushing all over why he loves this stuff, hey, I do that too on occasion. But be respectful. Be constructive if you're going to be critical. And remember, we all love entertainment. So even if you disagree on opinion, doesn't mean you have to start a fight over it. So come back in 7 days. We're going to talk about something else. It may be comic related. It may not be. Because there's a whole lot of entertainment. And I like a little bit of everything. So we are going to ramble every Friday. Don't miss it. Bye-bye, folks.